Blessings, good evening. So tonight is, we have a few questions to answer. Chance to reflect on the Dhamma. If any of the answers are helpful, that's good. If they're not, then never mind, just leave them where they are. Dear Ajahn, I'm about to lose my job. How do I stop myself becoming depressed? Come and become a monk or a nun. Turn crisis into opportunity, disaster into success. Many people have come into the Sangha, and one of the triggers or prompts was a change of work, losing a job, change of situation in such a way. Do something good if you can. So if you lose your job, well, one thing is reflect back on that job that you had and reflect on the good things that you had when you had that job, the good part of it. Maybe you made friends with work colleagues, you did useful things, you learnt new skills. Try to reflect back in a balanced way on your job, and even though there may be some inconvenience or sadness at losing your job, try to not hold on to resentment or aversion. Sometimes we lose a job, economic pressures and forces that you can't really pin down on one individual person. It's just the way life is, isn't it? Sometimes the job you do is no longer necessary for that company, or they can do without you, and they have to manage their budget or whatever. So it's not always a personal decision, but even if it is, just accept it. Sometimes someone else can do that job, we'll be happy for them. And then look more to the future. If you do lose your job, well, start applying for other jobs. Maybe look at other areas of work that you could go into as well. Obviously, if you lose your job, then be careful with your money. Take it as a time to live more simply, like a monastic. Spend less money so that whatever funds you have will last longer while you're waiting to get another job. Start a business. Start your own business. If you've been working for others, start your own business. See it as a challenge, maybe an unwanted challenge, but it's a challenge. So don't just look on the negative side of it, feel sorry for yourself and blame yourself or blame somebody who fired you or whatever. But try to just accept what's happened, accept it and move on, and then look for what you can do. Maybe it's a time for a break, so it could be a time you go on retreat, travel. Could be a time to practice the Dhamma while you're waiting for your new job. So try and see it as an opportunity rather than just a loss or a failure. Excuse me. I often mention the man who lost all his business because of flooding in Thailand a few years ago, when they had terrible flooding, and this man's factory that made auto parts was completely flooded, lost his factory, his stock, had to close the business down, lost his house was flooded, factory flooded. disaster all round. But he was somebody who had faith in the Buddha and put the Buddha's teachings into practice. And the Buddha, said, don't be lazy, don't give in when you have suffering, contemplate it, but don't give in to it or let it overwhelm you. Pick yourself up and put effort into whatever you're doing. So he talked to his wife and children and said, what can we do? We've lost our business, lost everything. And they said, we can cook noodles. If all else fails, make food. People need food to eat, so you can sell food. So they started cooking noodles and selling them on a street stall. And because they were hardworking and knew a bit about business and they made good noodles, they were very successful and moved from a street stall into a restaurant, opened a restaurant, and then eventually they opened a second restaurant and a third, and they started a franchise of noodle shops and then went in that direction and became very successful. So life is full of ups and downs. It's up to us to pick ourselves up the best we can, get support, get help if you need it. Think more positively, don't give in just to the unfortunate circumstances, but learn lessons and move on. In the end, a job is just a job. There's other things more important than that. You're not solely your job, are you? You have your Dhamma practice, you have family, friends. You're bigger than your job, so if you lose your job, don't worry. There's more to life than that. One job you'll never be short of in the world, or one job opportunity that's always there, is Sangha. So you can always become a monk. Next question. Luang Por, I keep remembering my past transgressions when I broke the 5 precepts. What can I do about this? Well, in a way, you could say that's a good thing, because you'll learn some lessons, won't you? The Buddha said we learn morality by seeing the danger and the harm of not keeping to morality, not living in an ethical way. So when you remember your past transgressions, that's your impetus to keep precepts, to be more mindful and restrained in your speech and your actions. And it's probably a sign that your mind is adjusting, isn't it? Especially if you meditate. You'll find when you practice meditation, you keep remembering all the harmful things you've said and done. And if you've done a lot, if there's been a period of your life where you really didn't keep the precepts, and those memories will come up. But now, under the light of mindfulness and some insight, and as you make your mind more peaceful, you'll see the suffering of your behavior that didn't follow the precepts, because you're seeing it as it comes up in your mind. And you may feel guilty, you may feel uncomfortable, restless, agitated when these memories come up. But that's teaching you, isn't it? It's teaching you the value of the precepts. If you keep the precepts, which perhaps you're doing now, then you don't generate that kind of karma that will come up again in your future meditation. Gradually the past memories will fade, especially if you're practicing mindfulness. You know a memory is just a memory. So every time it arises, you say, okay, this is the memory of past karma, past action, unskillful action. You know it, then you let it go. Gradually these will come up less and less and bother you less and less, because you're focusing on the present moment, establishing mindfulness, keeping the precepts in the present. So your old past transgressions won't bother you so much. But when they do come up, just take them as lessons, a reminder why we keep the precepts. Because when we don't, we regret it. Your mind has remorse, guilt. You're not peaceful. Sometimes you see people when they're meditating and they remember something they said or did that was very painful and hurtful. In that moment they can't sit still. They become physically agitated with the memory. And that's some of the karma, isn't it? Remembering your past lapses with morality, with precepts, things you've said and done that hurt others perhaps. You can't even sit still when the memory comes up. But that's something you can learn from, and you can see how agitating it is when you remember your mistakes. So then you re-establish your intention to follow the precepts at that point, seeing the suffering. When you remember your past transgressions, then you determine, well, from here on I won't do that again. And then eventually you can sit still and the memory pops up in your mind, but it's just a memory. You see it, you know it, and you let it go. Life is impermanent and our mind is changing all the time. Our actions arise and pass away, our mental states arise and pass away. So even though you carry memories and memories keep coming up, you can also reflect that that person who did those things is now changed. It was a time in the past where you did a lot of unskillful things perhaps, but that time has passed, it's changed. Now it's just a memory. That's not to excuse the behavior or deny it, it's just accepting that in that period of time you weren't so restrained or mindful or wise. We've all got that in our lives, some more than others, but we've all made mistakes and done things that we are not proud of or regret later. But that spurs you on to be more careful. And we know any arahant in the world, any enlightened being, will have memories of when they were not enlightened, when they were not on the path, where they still followed defilements and said and did things that were not correct. They'll have that just the same as us, but they managed to develop the right attitude, they develop right view, and they understand what is the path, behavior that is conducive to the path, what is not conducive to the path. They can separate, and they've learned their lessons. So even though they have memories of their past unskillful actions, those memories don't cause them fresh suffering. They recognize them as just memory. They now know the path, what the correct thing to do is and what the correct thing and what the wrong thing to do is. They know the difference. They've learned the lesson, so they can let go. So there's quite a few teachers I know in Thailand who've been brought up in farming families. So there were times when they killed fish or killed animals until they realized they didn't want to do it anymore, or maybe they knew all along that they didn't really want to do it, but there was a necessity, because often people in farming communities, it's just the way they live. They tend to kill animals for their food, but they reached a point where they just stopped. They said, I don't want to do this anymore. Drinking is another one. Often when you're young, you try things, drink and drugs, and then you realize later that this is not good for your brain, for your mindfulness, and so you stop. So many enlightened teachers can remember their past transgressions, but they just know a memory as a memory, and they've moved on. And that's what we have to, how we have to reflect. Another question, What should I do when my mind is overwhelmed by light during the breath meditation? Well, it's a very common experience when you're practicing meditation, developing one-pointedness, samadhi, using a meditation object such as the breath, that as you put more effort into it, and your mind does start to settle down and become more concentrated, more calm, then you'll experience physical and mental changes. So body and mind start to settle down. You experience rapture, joy, and sukha vedana, contentment, feelings of happiness, feelings of bliss. These will come up sometimes just briefly, sometimes more intensely and for a long time. They come up in different ways, these experiences, but the idea is to maintain mindfulness on your object through them all, because the qualities of rapture and sukha can be deluding, can be a cause for attachment, it can be distracting, because especially when they're new, you think about them. What is this? So light is one of them. As your mind becomes more peaceful and attention turns inwards, so you're no longer distracted by your senses, your external senses, then you're more in touch and more focused on the mind itself. Well, it's quite common for light to arise. The mind becomes brighter, literally like you're switching on a light inside your mind, because your attention is turned inwards, your mind is becoming more wholesome, because you let go of negative thoughts, the 5 hindrances. So light arises. But it can be a great distraction as well, because you start doubting about the light, you're curious about it, thinking about it, or decide to focus your mind on the light rather than the breath. And generally speaking, that's considered a mistake, because your object is still the breath. And if you leave the breath, move off to putting your attention on the bright light of the citta, the light nimitta, the bright light, generally speaking, your state of calm and your mindfulness will slip away, and you'll find actually you withdraw from the samadhi when you do that. So generally speaking, the best advice I would say is stick with the breath and be aware of any experiences of rapture, the lightness of body, or the body seems to disappear, bright lights, waves of rapture, these different feelings and different experiences. Just be aware of them, but don't make them the object of your mindfulness. Stick with the breath. Make your mindfulness really strong and continuous with the breath. And you'll find the breath itself changes, becomes more refined, more subtle. Quite often it slows down, even the whole metabolism of the body seems to slow down. And you may get to the point that your one-pointedness on the breath your mind becomes so still and one-pointed that the breath seems to stop moving altogether. And you can't even tell that the breath is moving in or out anymore. It's just, your mind is just there at that point where the movement stops. You just keep awareness there of the mind itself. And it's quite likely there'll be a bright light. But as I said, I would suggest not going towards the bright light or changing your object. Just stay with the mind at the point where the breath disappears. And practice keeping mindfulness there, the unwavering mind, the unification of the mind, one-pointedness of mind. Just keep with that and make your mindfulness on the object and that state of calm and stillness as strong and long-lasting as you can. There'll be plenty to learn from that experience, and hopefully it will come up again too. But generally I would say stick with the breath rather than going to the light. The last question. I don't feel I can believe in rebirth, so how can I practice Buddhism? Well, if you're here and thinking like that, there's probably a sign that there are other parts of the Buddhist teachings which you found helpful, attractive, inspiring. As one of the amazing things about the Dhamma, the teachings of the Buddha, is many aspects to it. Central to the Buddhist teachings are the Four Noble Truths, suffering, which is to be known, the cause of suffering, which is craving and attachment, which is to be abandoned, the cessation of suffering, which is to be realized, and then the path leading to the cessation of suffering, the Noble Eightfold Path, which is to be developed. This is the centre of the Buddhist teachings and doesn't immediately require a belief in rebirth or not. We're looking more at suffering as an experience, and you can look at that in your daily experience. So the Buddha said, if you don't believe in karma and rebirth yet, certainly you don't believe that when you die you'll be reborn, you can set it aside as an issue. It doesn't have to be an issue that you resolve right here, right now. More important is stress, suffering, and its origins right here, right now. And cultivate mindfulness and insight in the present moment into the nature of your body and mind and the nature of suffering. Where does suffering come from? And the Buddha said, well, observe, and you should see that when you identify with your five khandhas, body and mind, or body, feelings, perceptions, thought formations, sense consciousness, when you identify or cling to them with this sense of self, this is setting up the causes for suffering. And you can do that in this very life, in this very moment by moment, day by day. And you can start there. So the question of karma, rebirth, past life, future lives, you can set aside and investigate just your relationship between your mind and your attachment to the five khandhas, body and mind, and investigate there. That may be more useful to you. This is what the practice of vipassana is focusing on, developing mindfulness and then focusing on the nature of the five khandhas as impermanent, suffering, not self. And same with sila. If you reflect on sila, your speech, your action, behavior that leads to suffering or behavior that is restrained and harmless, it doesn't require belief in rebirth. Some people will talk about that. If you don't keep the precepts, you will get reborn in an unpleasant destination after you die. Well, that may be true, but you don't need to go there yet. Just look at the immediate results of your behavior every day. So if you're acting in anger or selfishness, leads you to not respect other people physically or verbally, harm them, abuse them, not respect property, looking at ways to steal or take people's property, not respect relationships, and you cheat on your partner or cheat with other people's partner and so on. Those are things that you can really see in your daily life. You can see cause and effect at work. If you are violent to someone, verbally or physically, they're going to suffer, you're going to probably regret it, it may lead to all kinds of unpleasant consequences. And you don't need to go as far as next life to prove that or understand that. So the Buddhist teachings, many people find them very practical, down to earth, verifiable in the here and now. And you don't need to wait until next life, until you're dead, to work out whether rebirth is true or not. You work on cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path, mindfulness, insight, restraint in the present moment. It's more valuable for you, perhaps. And over time, maybe you'll look more closely into karma, cause and effect, and maybe this will lead you to an understanding about rebirth as well. But you don't need to go there. You can set it aside for now, I would say. Like so many people, when you begin, even people who are brought up as a Buddhist, when they begin seriously practicing, learning meditation, listening to Dhamma perhaps on a regular basis, often even though they call themselves Buddhists, they don't know either. It's not like you're born a Buddhist or brought up a Buddhist and you automatically know all about rebirth. Most people will have doubts because there's very little you can prove about it, certainly in the beginning of your practice. But that's okay. You don't expect to understand every aspect of the Buddhist teachings because we have delusion, attachment, wrong views. You have to accept that as you begin your practice. But if you're practicing with what the Buddha taught and you find what he taught makes sense and it helps you as you're practicing to be more peaceful, to have more clarity, more understanding about life, about suffering, how to avoid suffering or end suffering. If it's effective as a teaching and as a way of practice, well, that's good enough, isn't it? You can say the teachings that I can work with and understand are good enough. And you keep practicing, and as you practice, you'll probably find you'll experience deeper happiness, deeper understanding, change your behavior for the better, hopefully. That's good enough in the sense you're gradually verifying or proving that the Buddhist teachings are correct on different levels. It's the same with samadhi, isn't it? Most people begin meditation, they don't experience states of calm or insight, samadhi yet. They may have moments of peace, but then a lot of not very peaceful states of mind. But over time, if you keep practicing, maybe over time you do start to experience more samadhi. So then you have some personal experience. You can say, well, I know a mind that is peaceful, I know what it's like, now I've experienced it. But in the beginning you may not. So in the beginning you're taking it on trust or faith that it's possible to train the mind to experience inner peace, inner happiness. But you have to practice first before you can conclude for sure that there is such a thing as, say, a mind of samadhi, one-pointedness, or not. So there's many aspects of the practice are like that. You take the Buddha's words and you work with them and you practice with them until you know for yourself. If you keep that attitude, you don't have to know everything from day one. You don't have to solve every doubt, every uncertainty. You put the doubts aside and then you keep practicing until you're more sure for yourself through your own experience. That's how the Buddha taught as well. He said, practice and know for yourself. Don't just take it on belief or faith. He said faith is a part of our practice, but it has to be governed by wisdom and combined with wisdom. You have to reflect on what you're doing, why, and then the results of your practice. Your faith starts to become knowledge, inner knowledge. But in the beginning it is faith, and that's a useful quality, but you can't expect to know everything. You have to practice. So if you don't know about rebirth, fine, just keep practicing until you do know one way or another that it's true or not. You can't deny, as the spies say, I can neither confirm nor deny, because you don't know. So just accept that until you practice to the point where you can confirm or deny. So, a few questions tonight. Hopefully that's been of some use to you in your practice, and we wish you will keep on practicing.